There is a moment in every mission, a moment most people never see, never feel, and never understand, when the entire weight of a decision compresses itself into a single breath. Not the moment of action, not the explosion, the strike, or the headline, the moment just before. The moment when a commander looks at the map, looks at his team, looks at the intelligence on the table, and asks himself one question that nobody else in the room can answer for him. Is this the point of no return? We are at that moment right now. Not in a briefing room, not in a classified bunker somewhere underneath Washington. We are at that moment as a civilization. And if you do not understand what is happening in the waters off Iran's Kharg Island, in the skies above Lebanon, in the corridors of Beijing, and in the Senate chambers of the United States, if you do not understand what those things mean together, not separately, but together, then you are not equipped for what is coming next. Stay with me. Because what I am about to lay out for you is not commentary. It is a situation report. And situation reports do not comfort you. They prepare you. Let me begin where every serious military analyst has to begin right now, with the nuclear question. The United States Secretary of Energy stood before the Senate and delivered words that should have stopped every conversation in every newsroom, every dinner table, and every government building in the free world. He said that Iran is frighteningly close to a nuclear weapon. Not years away, not a decade away with the right diplomacy and the right pressure, weeks. A matter of weeks from enriching a ton of uranium to weapons-grade level. Now, let me be precise here, because precision matters in high-stakes moments more than emotion does. Enrichment to weapons grade is not a finished bomb. There is still the matter of weaponization, turning enriched material into a deployable device, assembling a delivery system, achieving the kind of miniaturization that makes a nuclear warhead a real strategic instrument. Those steps take time. But here is what 40 years of military and intelligence experience teaches you about adversaries who are weeks away from a critical threshold. You do not wait until they cross it to decide what you are going to do about it. You decide now. You decide before, because after is too late. And history does not forgive the generals or the presidents who confuse patience with preparation. And while that warning was echoing through the Senate, something else was happening on the other side of the world that demands your full attention. Satellite imagery confirmed what analysts had been watching quietly for days. Around Kharg Island, Iran's most critical oil export terminal, the economic heartbeat of the Islamic Republic, the artery through which flows the money that pays for the missiles, the proxies, the nuclear program, and the Revolutionary Guards, around that island, there is almost no shipping. Tanker exports have stopped. Storage terminals are filling up, and in several locations, including on the island itself, there are signs of oil leaks. Now, if you are a civilian, you might read that and think, that sounds like an economic problem, and you would be right. But if you have ever planned a sustained military campaign, you understand that an economic problem of this magnitude is not a secondary effect. It is the campaign. The naval blockade is working. The pressure is real. And the question that every strategist in Washington, Jerusalem, Beijing, and Tehran is asking right now is the same question they always ask when the pressure reaches this level. Who breaks first? I want you to understand something about oil infrastructure that most people never consider until it becomes a crisis. You cannot simply shut down an oil production system the way you turn off a kitchen faucet. Oil wells operate on pressure systems, pipelines, pumping stations, storage facilities, processing plants. They are interconnected in ways that make a sudden stoppage not just economically damaging, but technically catastrophic. When storage fills up and production has nowhere to go, operators face an impossible choice. Shut down the wells at enormous cost and risk of long-term damage to the reservoir, or find somewhere, anywhere, to move the product. Iran right now has nowhere to move it. And every day that tankers do not load at Kharg Island, Iran loses approximately $139 million in daily oil revenue. That is not a rounding error. That is the fuel that feeds every component of the Iranian war machine. The missiles, the proxy forces in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Gaza, the scientists working on the nuclear program, the guards who suppress the Iranian people in the streets. Cut the money long enough, and the machine begins to seize. The question is whether the pressure holds long enough to matter before a political or military miscalculation forces a different kind of escalation. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about how great powers actually negotiate under pressure. Because on the same day that satellite images were confirming the stranglehold around Kharg Island, on the same day that the Energy Secretary was warning the Senate about nuclear timelines measured in weeks, the President of the United States was standing on a red carpet in Beijing. There was an orchestra. There were children waving flags. There was a ceremony at the Great Hall of the People. All the symbols that China deploys when it wants to project something specific to the world: power, order, permanence, control. And the two most consequential leaders on the planet were exchanging compliments that would have seemed almost surreal against the backdrop of what was happening simultaneously in the Persian Gulf. Xi Jinping told Trump that the world had reached a new crossroads. He called on the two powers to be partners, not rivals. Trump praised the Chinese president as a great leader, called the relationship between the two countries extraordinary. Elon Musk was in the room. The CEO of NVIDIA was there, calling the two leaders amazing. And beneath all of it, beneath every handshake and every carefully worded public statement, there was a negotiation happening that was really about one thing: who controls the Strait of Hormuz, and what price is China willing to pay or not pay to keep it open. Here is the strategic reality that most news coverage fails to communicate clearly. China is not a neutral party in the Iran crisis. China is one of the largest buyers of Iranian oil on the planet. It has spent years building economic relationships with Tehran that provide the Islamic Republic with a financial lifeline that partially insulates it from Western sanctions. China needs the Strait of Hormuz open, not because it is a global citizen committed to freedom of navigation, though it will use that language, but because its own energy supply chains and export routes run directly through that waterway. A prolonged closure of the strait does not only hurt Iran, it destabilizes global shipping, spikes energy costs, and creates exactly the kind of economic turbulence that threatens Chinese growth and therefore Chinese political stability. So when Trump sits across from Xi in Beijing, he is not just having a conversation about trade deficits and semiconductor supply chains. He is presenting a choice. You can use your leverage with Tehran to bring this crisis to a negotiated close, or you can protect your Iranian ally behind the scenes and watch the military option return to the center of the table with consequences that no one in this room will enjoy. That is the real conversation behind the red carpets and the orchestras. But here is what I have learned in a lifetime of operating in complex, high-stakes environments. The conversation in the room is almost never the whole story. The whole story is what each party does in the 72 hours after they leave the room. And right now, both sides know something critical about the other's constraints. Trump knows that Xi cannot openly abandon Iran without creating a perception of Chinese weakness that reverberates across every other alliance and dependency relationship Beijing manages from Islamabad to Caracas. Xi knows that Trump is operating against a political clock that is not infinite, a World Cup that begins in exactly 1 month on American soil, an Independence Day celebration, midterm elections in November, and an American public that measures success in outcomes, not process. The Iranians know all of this too, and here is where the danger lives, in the space between what each side is projecting publicly and what each side is actually willing to do. The Revolutionary Guards in Tehran have made a calculation. They believe they can outlast the pressure. They have survived sanctions before. They have survived strikes before. They have survived economic isolation, diplomatic isolation, proxy defeats, and the assassination of their most capable commanders. And every time the world predicted their collapse, they found a way to survive. That institutional memory of survival shapes everything about how they are approaching this moment. They are not coming to the negotiating table like a government seeking compromise. They are coming with a list of demands designed first to relieve the pressure and second, only second, to address the substance. They want sanctions removed. They want frozen assets released. They want war compensation. They want an end to fighting on all fronts. And they want what amounts to Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz through shipping agreements with Iraq and Pakistan that route oil and gas revenues through the strait on Iranian terms. Notice what is not on that list: the nuclear program, the missile arsenals, the proxy network across Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Gaza. Those are not opening concessions. Those are not even on the table yet, because if Iran can get economic relief first, if the pressure comes off before the structural capabilities are addressed, then Iran wins the negotiation regardless of what the final agreement says. Money buys time, time allows reconstruction, reconstruction restores capability, and restored capability means that in 18 months, in 2 years, in 3 years, we are having this exact same conversation again, except Iran will be starting from a more advanced position than it occupies today. This is the trap. This is the strategic trap that Washington understands and that Israel has been warning about for years. And if you think the pressure on the negotiating table is complex now, you are not ready for what the intelligence reports are telling us about what is happening beneath the surface inside Iran. Because here is what the latest American intelligence assessment reveals. And this is where the situation becomes genuinely alarming for anyone who understands force reconstitution timelines. Despite 40 days of intense American and Israeli strikes on the Islamic Republic, despite the naval blockade, despite the economic strangulation, Iran has managed to restore access to 30 out of 33 missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz. Intelligence analysts assess that Iran still retains approximately 70% of its mobile missile launchers and approximately 70% of the missile arsenal it possessed before this war began. The underground launch facilities, the tunnel networks, the hardened storage sites. Iran built those over decades specifically to survive exactly the kind of sustained air campaign it has been subjected to. And a senior Iranian official has already issued the next threat on the nuclear side. If the pressure continues, Iran will enrich to 90%. That is not a scientific statement. That is a strategic ultimatum. It is Iran telling the world, telling Washington and Jerusalem directly, that if you keep pressing on the economic and military fronts, we will accelerate toward the one threshold that frightens you most. And we will do it openly, deliberately, and without apology. The American response is clear. It has to be. Iran must hand over its enriched uranium, not stored in a third country with a guarantee to retrieve it later, not transfer part of it under a monitoring agreement that can be violated or renegotiated. Hand it over. Because from a serious strategic standpoint, and I want to be direct with you here, the way I would be direct with a junior officer who needed to understand the stakes. A beautiful diplomatic agreement that leaves the materials, the facilities, the missiles, and the money in place is not a victory. It is a pause. It is a timeout called by a team that is down by one score and needs 30 seconds to catch its breath before the final drive. A real agreement changes capabilities, not just postures. It removes the physical infrastructure of the threat, not just the rhetoric surrounding it. And right now, Iran's demands are structured precisely to avoid that outcome. So here is where we stand at this moment in history. The United States and Israel are managing a multi-front pressure campaign against an adversary that has survived everything thrown at it before and believes it can survive this too. The nuclear clock is ticking in weeks, not months. The oil revenues are being strangled, but the regime has not broken. The missile capability has been damaged, but not destroyed. China is in the room, but its ultimate choice is still unclear. And a decision is coming, not if, but when, about whether to continue with the blockade and the diplomacy or to execute a short, decisive military strike and return to the negotiating table from a position of overwhelming strength. But before you think you understand the full picture, before you think the answer lies entirely in the military and diplomatic calculus, there is something happening inside Iran that changes everything about how you have to think about this conflict. Something that the Western media has almost entirely failed to report. Something that an expert in the Persian language, Iranian culture, and the real lived experience of the Iranian people under this regime will reveal in a moment that will reframe everything you thought you knew. Because the most dangerous enemy of the Islamic Republic is not sitting in the Pentagon. It is not sitting in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem. The most dangerous enemy of the Islamic Republic of Iran is living in the streets of Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, and Shiraz. And what is happening in those streets right now, what has been suppressed, what has been massacred, what has been ignored by the Western press, and what is still burning beneath the surface is the factor that no satellite image, no missile count, and no diplomatic communique can fully capture. Stay with me, because what comes next will change the way you see this entire conflict. There is a principle that every commander learns, not in the classroom, not in the war college, but in the field, in the mud, in the moment when the mission stops going according to plan. The principle is this: the most dangerous enemy is not always the one pointing a weapon at you. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one your adversary is trying to keep locked inside his own borders. And in the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran, that enemy is 87 million people who did not choose this regime, did not vote for this war, and do not share the Revolutionary Guard's appetite for martyrdom and regional domination. Understanding that distinction between the Iranian regime and the Iranian people is not a humanitarian observation. It is a strategic necessity, because the outcome of this conflict will not be determined solely by missile counts, oil revenues, or diplomatic summits in Beijing. It will be determined by whether the Iranian street finally breaks the back of a regime that has ruled through fear, executions, internet blackouts, and massacre for over 4 decades. Let me tell you what happened in January of 2026 that most of the Western world simply chose not to see. Millions of Iranians responded to the call of the Crown Prince and took to the streets. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions. They burned mosques, not out of your religion, but because those mosques had become instruments of oppression rather than houses of God. They shouted, "Javid Shah, long live the king." They shouted that this was the last battle. They chanted for unity across ethnic lines: Kurds, Baluch, Arabs, Azeris, groups that the regime had always counted on to remain divided, suddenly marching under the same banner toward the same goal. And the regime's response was not negotiation. It was not reform. It was not even the pretense of political accommodation. The regime sent militia forces into those streets and slaughtered between 30 and 70,000 people in a single night. 30 to 70,000 human beings in one night. And the Western press, the same press that covers every protest in every Western capital with breathless minute-by-minute reporting, looked at that massacre and mostly moved on. Some outlets took days to even mention it. Some framed it around the burning of mosques rather than around the mass killing of civilians. And some Western organizations actually held demonstrations in support of the regime because the protesters were burning religious buildings and therefore must be the aggressors. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it matters. It matters not just morally, though it matters enormously morally. It matters strategically. When the Iranian people look outward and ask, where is the world? Where are the students who march for other causes? Where are the European governments that speak constantly about human rights and democratic values? And they see silence, or worse, active sympathy for the regime that just massacred tens of thousands of their fellow citizens, what they conclude is that they are alone. And a population that believes it is alone is a population that the regime can continue to manage, suppress, and exhaust. The West's failure to stand clearly with the Iranian people is not just a moral failure. It is a strategic gift to the Islamic Republic. But here is what the regime knows, even as it projects strength outward. The Revolutionary Guards are more afraid of the Iranian people than they are of the United States military and the Israeli Air Force combined. That is not an exaggeration. That is the assessment of people who study this regime from the inside out. A government that is confident in its legitimacy does not need to hang citizens in public squares to frighten the streets. It does not need to shut down the internet for 5 days after a protest. It does not need to deploy militia forces to massacre its own population in the middle of the night. It does those things because it understands at an institutional level that the real existential threat does not come from across the ocean or across the border. It comes from within. And every execution, every internet blackout, every midnight arrest is an admission of that fear dressed up in the language of strength. And what comes next in this conflict will force a reckoning with a question that nobody in Washington or Jerusalem has fully answered yet. What happens the day after? What happens if the military pressure, the naval blockade, and the economic strangulation succeed in bringing the regime to its knees? Who fills the vacuum? Who governs? Who rebuilds? Because the Middle East has taught the world a brutal lesson in the years since the Arab Spring. Removing a dictator without a credible, organized, popularly supported successor structure does not produce democracy. It produces chaos. It produces the conditions in which the next authoritarian fills the space, often more violently than the one who was removed. And the Iranian people, informed by that history, living inside that reality, are not simply asking for the regime to fall. They are asking for something to replace it that is worthy of the sacrifices they have already made. The Crown Prince has offered a framework, 100 days of stabilization, a referendum on the future form of government, a commitment to not become another dictator. And the Iranian people inside Iran, not the exile community with its various political agendas, not the MEK with its cult-like organizational structure and near zero popular support on the ground, but the actual people living under this regime, including anti-royalists who would never have imagined rallying behind a crown prince, are rallying behind him. Because in a moment of existential crisis, people do not always choose the perfect option. They choose the option that represents the possibility of survival and change. And right now, for millions of Iranians, he is that option. The West's reluctance to recognize and support that movement is one of the most consequential strategic miscalculations of this entire crisis. Because a transition with a legitimate, popularly supported leader is infinitely preferable to a transition into the unknown. And the window for supporting that outcome is not permanently open. Windows close, moments pass. And history does not wait for the comfortable consensus of those who preferred to watch from a distance. Now, let me bring you back to the operational picture because the ground situation demands it. On the northern front, the ceasefire with Lebanon is holding, but holding the way a cracked dam holds. The pressure behind it is enormous, and the structure is compromised. Representatives of Israel and Lebanon met in Washington for a third round of talks, and the gaps between the two sides remain significant. Lebanon wants a permanent ceasefire, a full Israeli withdrawal from the security zone, and a halt to the demolition of Hezbollah infrastructure near the border. Israel's position is equally firm. No withdrawal while Hezbollah retains the capability and the intent to threaten the residents of the north. No agreement that leaves the Iranian proxy armed, active, and politically protected inside Lebanese territory. From Israel's perspective, an agreement that does not address Hezbollah's actual capability is not a security arrangement. It is a countdown timer to the next round. And from Lebanon's perspective, a country already in deep economic and political crisis, a country that did not choose this war and is now paying an enormous price for being used as Iran's forward operating base, every additional day of strikes and demolitions deepens a wound that will take a generation to heal. And here is something that deserves your full attention, because it represents a genuinely historic shift. Lebanon filed an official complaint with the United Nations Security Council against Iran, against Hezbollah. This is a country that for decades served as the primary theater for Iranian influence operations in the Arab world. This is a government that coexisted with and was in many ways held hostage by Hezbollah's armed presence on its territory. And that government is now telling the Security Council publicly that Iran dragged Lebanon into a war it did not choose, that Iranian personnel were operating inside Lebanese territory without Lebanese government authorization, that some of those personnel were not even registered as diplomats, that Lebanese sovereignty was violated by the very power that claimed to be protecting Arab dignity and resistance against Israel. That statement, coming from Beirut, is not a footnote. It is a fracture in the Iranian regional architecture that has been decades in the making, and the implications ripple outward across the entire axis that Tehran has built from Lebanon through Syria to Iraq to Yemen. Simultaneously, in the Gulf, a new strategic reality is crystallizing that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. United Arab Emirates, a Gulf monarchy, an Arab state, a Muslim-majority country, emerged from the latest confrontation with Iran with its relationship with Israel stronger than at any previous point in their shared history. Israel developed and deployed air defense systems on Emirati soil, Iron Dome, the Magen laser system, advanced UAV detection platforms. An Arab country is defending itself from Iranian threats using Israeli technology. And Tehran's response to that revelation was to declare that the UAE is no longer a neighbor, but a hostile base. That sentence tells you everything about how the Iranian regime processes regional reality. Any country that chooses self-defense over submission, any country that pursues its own security interests rather than subordinating them to Iranian regional ambitions, becomes an enemy. The geography of the new Middle East is being drawn not by the lines on colonial-era maps, but by the choices nations are making about who threatens them and who helps them survive. Here is where everything converges. The naval blockade is tightening around Kharg Island. The nuclear clock is running in weeks. The missile capability is damaged, but not destroyed. The diplomatic summit in Beijing has produced smiles and handshakes, but the hard choices remain unmade. The Iranian street is suffocating under a regime that is simultaneously weakened and ruthless. Lebanon has turned on Tehran. The Gulf states are moving toward Israel. And a decision is approaching in Washington about whether to continue the current pressure campaign or to execute a decisive military move that resets the terms of the entire confrontation.